It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas night. In the far north of Nigeria, families in rural villages had gone to sleep after another difficult years marked by fear, extortion, kidnappings, and silence. Then, without warning, the sky changed. Explosions echoed through forests that most Nigerians will never see on a map. On Christmas Day, December 25, 2025, U.S. bombs struck deep inside Sokoto State. And almost immediately, something strange happened. Instead of national relief, instead of clear answers, Nigeria filled with confusion and anger. Not anger toward terrorists, but toward the strike itself. Some voices began to cry foul, others rushed to downplay what had happened, and for nearly 2 days much of the mainstream media seemed unsure or unwilling to explain where those bombs really landed. So let's ask a simple question. Why would anyone mourn a strike that hit terrorist camps? According to residents of Masalaki and Tangaza, the bombs did not fall on farms. They fell on forests that had long been taken over by armed groups, forests where terrorists built permanent camps, forests where they dug wells, stored weapons, and ruled surrounding communities through fear. For years, villagers paid levies just to harvest their own crops. Fathers were kidnapped, livestock vanished, normal life disappeared. Yet these realities were barely discussed until investigative reporters from Arise News went there themselves. Risking their lives, they documented what local people had been saying quietly for years. The terrorists were real, entrenched, and protected by silence. Now the bombs have exposed what words never could. This story is not just about airstrikes. It is about truth. It is about what happens when terrorism becomes normalized, when fear replaces accountability, and when ordinary people are left alone to survive between armed groups and political denial. For American viewers watching from afar, this raises serious questions. Can terrorism be defeated without honesty? Can security exist when the past is never confronted? And what responsibility does the international community carry after the bombs stop falling? Stay with us as we walk carefully through what happened, what was revealed, and what comes next. Please share this video if you believe truth matters more than comfort. Subscribe if you think silence is more dangerous than speaking out. To understand what truly happened, we have to move away from speculation and return to the ground where the explosions were heard, where the fear had lived long before the bombs fell. In the early hours following Christmas Day, residents of Masalaki, a community in Tangaza local government area of Sokoto State, began telling a consistent story. They did not speak of farms being hit. They spoke of forests, dense, isolated areas that had long been off-limits to ordinary civilians. These were not empty forests. According to the villagers, they had become the operational hubs of armed groups terrorizing the region for years. What the people described was not chaos, but precision. They said the bombs landed deep inside known terrorist territories, destroying camps that had been hidden in plain sight. These camps were not temporary hideouts. They were permanent installations, places where weapons were stored, motorcycles and fuel were kept, and fighters moved in and out with confidence. For the villagers, this was not news. It was long-standing reality. What changed was that someone finally acted. According to multiple local accounts, several missile strikes hit these forest locations. While exact military figures were not officially released in the early hours, residents reported that numerous terrorists were killed and that critical logistics supplies, shelters, and movement routes were destroyed. Survivors among the armed groups were seen fleeing the area, some moving toward border routes that connect Nigeria to neighboring Sahel countries. This detail matters. Tangaza is not just a rural community. It sits near transnational corridors linking Niger, Burkina, Faso, Mali, and beyond. For years, traders, herders, and travelers had quietly complained that armed men used these routes, freely crossing borders, while civilians remained trapped. The strike disrupted that flow, at least temporarily. Yet despite the scale of what had occurred, national clarity was slow to arrive. For nearly 48 hours, much of Nigeria's mainstream media focused on isolated reports of a bomb landing on farmland, an incident that quickly dominated public discussion. Meanwhile, the primary targets, the terrorist camps themselves, received little immediate attention. This imbalance fueled confusion, suspicion, and political noise. It was during this silence that investigative reporting became crucial. Journalists from Arise News traveled directly to affected communities, speaking not only to villagers, but also to traders and residents familiar with the forest routes. What they confirmed aligned closely with what locals had been saying. From the start, the strikes were aimed at long-established terrorist bases, not civilian settlements. People on the ground described hearing explosions, followed by unusual movement fighters, abandoning positions, leaving behind burned structures and destroyed equipment. Some villagers said they had never seen such disruption among the armed groups before. For the first time in years, fear appeared to shift direction. But relief did not come easily. Residents were cautious, even restrained. They understood that airstrikes alone do not equal safety. Many had lived through past operations that promised change, but delivered only temporary calm. Still, there was a noticeable difference this time. The camps that once felt untouchable had been hit. The forests that symbolized permanent danger had been exposed. This is why the reaction to the strike revealed something deeper than politics. The real story was not just that bombs fell, it was that a long-ignored truth surfaced. Terrorist groups had operated openly, comfortably, and continuously in parts of northern Nigeria. They collected money-controlled farmland and enforced rules on civilians, often without sustained challenge. For the people of Masalachi and Tangaza, the strike did not create instability, it interrupted it, and that distinction is critical. As we move forward, the question is no longer whether the attack happened or where the bombs landed. The question is whether this moment will lead to lasting security or whether once again the world will look away after the smoke clears. In the next section, we will examine what investigators found inside those forests and why the discoveries shocked even seasoned reporters. The turning point of this story did not come from official statements or social media arguments. It came from the ground when journalists walked into places most people were too afraid to enter. As reporters from Arise News moved through Tangaza and surrounding communities, a pattern began to emerge. Villagers were not guessing. They were not speculating. They were describing what they had lived with for years and what they saw change after the strikes. What they revealed was deeply unsettling. Inside the forests of Kawuri Kandam and Malgam terrorists were not merely hiding. They were settled. According to residents and traders who knew these routes, armed groups had built permanent structures deep in the bush. Not makeshift tents, but solid shelters. They dug boreholes and wells to ensure constant water supply. They created storage areas for fuel weapons and stolen livestock. These were not temporary camps for hit-and-run operations. They were long-term bases. In other words, the forests had been turned into towns without names. For local communities, this was not abstract terrorism. It was daily domination. Farmers explained how they were forced to pay levies just to harvest crops they had planted with their own hands. Families spoke quietly about kidnappings, breadwinners taken not because they were wealthy, but because armed men knew someone would sell everything to bring them home. Traders described roads where travel depended on permission from men with guns. Fear was not an event, it was an atmosphere. This is why the reaction to the airstrikes was immediate and visible. Witnesses described seeing armed men abandon positions they had occupied for years. Some fled northward, others moved toward known cross-border routes linking Nigeria to Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. People who had memorized the rhythms of terror noticed something different: silence where there had once been confidence. But the climax of this moment was not celebration, it was revelation. As images began circulating, many Nigerians struggled to believe what they were seeing. Videos showed destroyed structures in the forest houses that looked disturbingly livable. To outsiders, the footage seemed exaggerated. To locals, it simply confirmed what they had been saying all along. This disbelief sparked anger. Some asked how terrorists could build such infrastructure without detection. Others questioned how long these camps had existed, and many wondered why it took foreign bombs for the truth to surface. The airstrike did not just destroy camps, it shattered a national illusion that the problem was smaller, simpler, or temporary. Reactions inside Nigeria quickly split into two emotional currents. On one side were communities closest to the violence. Their response was cautious relief. No cheering, no triumph. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something long untouched had finally been confronted. But their relief was fragile. They knew too well that without follow-up, abandoned camps could become occupied again. On the other side was political and media discomfort. Questions began circulating about consolidation. Would Nigerian troops move in to secure these areas? Would clearance operations continue, or would the forests be left empty for a few weeks only to refill with armed men under new names? This concern was echoed even by journalists themselves. During live reporting, correspondents openly questioned whether airstrikes alone could change anything lasting. They emphasized that success depended on what happened after the bomb's ground presence, intelligence sharing, and rebuilding trust with communities that had been ignored for years. Another uncomfortable truth emerged during these conversations. Many villagers admitted that some terrorists had become deeply embedded in local society. Marriages had occurred, relationships formed. In certain places, armed men were no longer outsiders, they were neighbors. This blurred line between civilian and militant made future security operations far more complex and emotionally charged. The climax of this story, then, was not the explosion. It was the exposure. Exposure of how deeply terrorism had rooted itself. Exposure of how long communities endured in silence. Exposure of how fragile security becomes when denial replaces accountability. And perhaps most unsettling of all, exposure of how easily the truth could have remained buried if no one had gone to look. As the dust settled, one question hung in the air across Tangaza and beyond. Was this the beginning of real change, or just another moment of clarity before the world moved on? In the next section, we will confront the political consequences of what was revealed and the uncomfortable decisions that helped create this reality in the first place. When the smoke cleared over the forests of northern Nigeria, what remained was not just damaged camps, but unanswered questions that cut deep into civilian life and political responsibility. For communities in Tangaza and surrounding areas, the consequences were immediate and emotional. Families who had lived under silent terror for years now faced a fragile pause. Fields once harvested under threat felt briefly accessible again. Roads that required permission from armed men suddenly felt uncertain but open. This moment was not celebration. It was hesitation. People had learned that safety in this region rarely lasts without protection. The civilians understood something that politicians often avoid: violence does not disappear simply because a base is destroyed. It relocates, adapts, and sometimes returns stronger. But beyond civilian fear, a more troubling political reckoning began to surface. Local voices started recalling a history that many preferred forgotten. The armed group known as Lakarawa did not arrive overnight. According to multiple accounts referenced during field reporting, their presence dated back years, some said as early as 2018. Initially, they were not universally rejected. In some communities, they were tolerated. In others, quietly invited. This is where the political consequences become uncomfortable. Several local narratives suggest that at different moments, officials viewed these fighters not as enemies, but as tools, temporary enforcers meant to counter banditry, tribal conflict, or local instability. Some residents recalled periods when these groups acted as informal regulators, imposing rules on behavior, dress, farming practices, and movement under the guise of religious or moral reform. What began as convenience became catastrophe. As these armed groups entrenched themselves, they shifted from control to exploitation. Livestock rustling escalated. Kidnappings became systematic. Levies were imposed on harvests. Resistance was punished. By the time the state recognized the full threat, the groups were no longer guests. They were landlords of fear. This context adds weight to a controversial claim referenced by the video's narrator, one involving statements attributed to Christopher Musa, Nigeria's former chief of defense staff and later defense minister. According to the narrator, Musa had previously suggested in an interview that these groups were initially welcomed and even described as good people during their early arrival. Whether framed as miscalculation, political desperation, or strategic failure, the implication remains severe. Terrorism in this region did not grow only because of foreign influence or porous borders. It grew because of decisions made at home. For civilians, this realization is painful. They were asked to endure fear in the name of stability. They were told that accommodation would bring peace. Instead, they lost years of normal life: schools, disrupted markets, abandoned families, shattered. The airstrikes exposed not only terrorist infrastructure, but the cost of delayed accountability. Politically, the consequences are equally serious. Trust has eroded. Communities now question whether future security policies will protect them or merely manage them. The call for consolidation after the strikes reflects this mistrust. People are asking, will troops move in? Will abandoned camps be secured? Or will silence return once international attention fades? The danger now is not just renewed violence, it is historical amnesia. If these events are framed only as foreign intervention or isolated strikes, the deeper lessons will be lost. The real challenge lies in confronting how armed groups were allowed to root themselves so deeply and why warnings from rural communities went unheard for so long. For the people of Tangaza, the bombs were not the beginning of the story. They were the consequence of years of political avoidance. And unless that reality is addressed, the cycle risks repeating itself quietly, patiently, and once again at civilian expense. From an American perspective, the events in northern Nigeria raise questions that go far beyond one airstrike or one Christmas night operation. They force us to confront how modern terrorism survives and how easily it adapts when the world looks away. For the United States, the strike was a tactical decision. Precision air power, limited exposure, and a clear target entrenched terrorist camps that local communities had identified for years. From a military standpoint, the mission appeared effective. Camps were destroyed. Fighters were dispersed. Supply routes were disrupted. But strategy does not end when the bombs stop falling. American audiences, especially those who remember long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, understand this lesson well. Airstrikes can break momentum, but they cannot rebuild trust. They can disrupt networks, but they cannot replace governance. And without follow-through, they often leave behind a vacuum more dangerous than the original threat. This is where the global implications become clear. Northern Nigeria sits at the edge of a volatile corridor stretching across the Sahel, linking Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and beyond. Terrorist groups in this region do not respect borders. When pressure increases in one location, fighters relocate. When camps are destroyed, alliances shift. What happens in Tangaza does not stay in Tangaza. For years, international observers have warned that instability in the Sahel is no longer a regional problem, it is a transnational one. Migration routes, arms trafficking, and extremist recruitment flow along the same paths used by traders and herders. When terrorist groups build permanent infrastructure in forests, they are not planning for months. They are planning for generations. This reality puts the United States in a familiar but uncomfortable position. On one hand, inaction allows threats to grow quietly until intervention becomes unavoidable. On the other, intervention without accountability risks enabling the very conditions that allowed terrorism to spread in the first place. The strike in Sokoto exposed camps, but it also exposed years of political hesitation, local compromises, and institutional weakness. For American viewers, this raises a difficult question. What does responsible involvement actually look like? It cannot mean endless military engagement, and it cannot mean symbolic strikes followed by silence. Responsibility, if it exists at all, must include pressure for transparency, support for civilian protection, and insistence on consolidation, real physical security on the ground after operations conclude. Globally, other nations are watching closely. If terrorist groups are allowed to embed themselves within civilian societies for years without consequence, the message is clear: patience pays. If accountability only comes through foreign intervention, local trust erodes further. And if the world responds only when violence becomes undeniable, then prevention has already failed. The United States did not create Nigeria's internal challenges, but once it acts, it becomes part of the outcome whether intended or not. This moment, therefore, is not just about what America did, it is about what happens next. Will this strike mark the beginning of sustained pressure against entrenched extremism? Or will it become another footnote remembered briefly then forgotten as fighters resettle elsewhere? History suggests that the answer depends less on firepower and more on what the world demands after the smoke clears. In the final section, we will return to the people most affected by all of this and ask what lessons cannot afford to be ignored. When we step back from the explosions, the footage, and the arguments, one truth remains difficult to ignore. What happened in northern Nigeria was not sudden. It was revealed. The U.S. airstrikes did not create terrorism in Tangaza or Masalaki. They exposed how long it had already been there, how deeply it had settled into forests, routines, and silence. For years, armed groups lived alongside civilians, taxed their harvests, controlled their movement, and reshaped daily life. Not because they were invisible, but because confronting them was postponed again and again. That is the real warning of this story. Terrorism does not always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it arrives slowly through compromise, denial, and political convenience. It grows strongest where accountability is weakest. And when the truth is finally forced into the open, the consequences are always heavier than they needed to be. For the villagers of northern Nigeria, this moment is fragile. The fear has not vanished. It has paused. Without consolidation, without sustained security, justice, and rebuilding, empty camps can refill. Fighters can resettle. Silence can return. And history once again can repeat itself quietly. For the international community, especially the United States, the lesson is equally sobering. Military power can interrupt terror, but it cannot replace responsibility. Precision strikes can dismantle camps, but they cannot rebuild trust between citizens and institutions. If the world responds only at the point of explosion, never at the point of warning, then every intervention arrives late. This is not just a Nigerian story, it is a global one. Across Africa, across the Middle East, across regions where governments struggle and communities feel abandoned, the same pattern repeats. When people are left alone with fear, armed groups fill the gap. When truth is delayed, violence becomes normalized. And when accountability is avoided, the cost is eventually paid by civilians. So the question we should be asking now is not only about airstrikes, it is about honesty. Can a nation defeat terrorism without confronting how it was allowed to grow? Can security exist where past mistakes are never acknowledged? And can the world truly claim to fight extremism if it only reacts, never prevents? These are uncomfortable questions, especially for those who prefer simple answers. But they matter, because silence does not protect lives, it only delays consequences. As this story fades from headlines, remember the people who lived it long before it reached the news. Remember that security is not built in the sky, but on the ground through truth, responsibility, and sustained commitment. Please share this video if you believe that confronting hard truths is the first step toward real security. Subscribe if you think the world must stop waiting for crises before paying attention. And most importantly, tell us in the comments, do you believe these lessons will be learned or forgotten once again?